All right, welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is Europe's Industrial Revolution, the first one. And we're going to talk about 5 things that you need to know in order to understand how it shaped European life at the end of the 1700s and the early 1800s. So let's get into it. If, like me, if you grew up in the United States, when you first hear about industrialization or the first thoughts in your head that you have about industrialization, they're usually American, right? So they're going to be Henry Ford. They're going to be a guy like Andrew Carnegie, although for Pittsburghers, that's not the right way to pronounce his name. You're going to start thinking about that kind of stuff. That's later, all right? That's a lot later. Real industrialization begins in England in the early 1800s. Now, there's stuff happening at the end of the 1700s, but it begins in the early 1800s, and it transforms everything when it comes to how English people live their lives day to day. It was difficult, it impoverished many, and it also rose up a new middle class that dominated much of England for the 19th century in this Victorian era. All right, so first off, division of labor. When we're talking about industrialization, what we're usually talking about is the mass production of a particular good. But that particular good cannot be mass produced unless you take and mechanize the processes of production. And what tends to happen with that is you have a laborer or an occupation or a professional who knows how to produce that good in the more artisan way, the old school way, for lack of a better phrase. They take all of the necessary processes to produce that good, and they break it into a new kind of way of production that is now mechanized and divided. The way it was explained to me was, let's say you have a butcher, and let's say that butcher is knowledgeable and they know how to produce cuts of meat, dozens and dozens of cuts of meat. They're very knowledgeable. Now, how do many people who enjoy meat get their meat? They get it at a grocery store, where it has come from a meat packing plant. Does the individual on the line in a meat packing plant know what a butcher would know? No. You know, they make one cut, boom, boom, done. The division of labor is the process by which you take one occupation and break it into a mechanized form of many less skilled occupations. Okay. Secondly, cottage industry. Much of the early process of industrialization in England revolved around 1, textiles, 2, mechanization, and 3, doing this stuff at home. So you had folks who would take goods piecemeal to their home, would produce them, then bring them back to a centrally located, area. You can call this, whatever you want, but generally the phrase cottage industry is used a lot. And again, in England, textile industries, right? So taking cotton, manufacturing cloth out of it, making clothes out of it, right? This is really what drives, this is really what drives this. And that brings us to number 3, cotton and textiles. So in English cities, like Manchester and others, ones that we might today think of globally more for soccer or football, it is these communities that are the drivers of this. It is these communities that the factories will be in for this, where individuals will come to these now large mechanized areas here, where you have new tools like spinning jennies and these mechanized looms, all of these new kinds of tools that have been developed over the last generation or so of the 1700s, that by the early 1800s folks are going to be working at. 4th, coal. In order to power most of this, you're going to need new kinds of engines, and of course there will be water power with this. Of course there'll be mills and this kind of thing. But it is the wide availability of coal across England which is going to help to fuel this process of industrialization. There are, other areas across the world that have the same economic capacity in the early 1800s, but they don't have the coal. They don't have the ability to fuel these engines, whereas the English just happen to have this kind of thing. All right. And this brings us to our last point, which is Chartists. So the Chartists are a reform movement in the early 1800s in England that reflected the political and economic disparity that existed in the country in the first half of the 19th century. So when you have this movement from an agricultural to an industrial economy in England, you have quite a great deal of urbanization and poverty that's going to rise, and a real feeling on the part of many that their rights are not being met, that they're not being able to be heard, and that their lives are not better off at all. They're much worse because of this. And so you have a lot of groups that are speaking out on this. Now, the government wasn't particularly too happy about this. The Peterloo Massacre, being a good example of that. But the Chartists are speaking out on this in the 1830s, early 1840s. All right. Thank you so much.